Germany gathered nearly 250,000 men, 2,000 tanks, and its last real reserves of fuel for one final gamble to win the war in the West, and lost the entire gamble within 6 weeks of hard, brutal winter fighting. This is the story of 5 compounding mistakes that turned Adolf Hitler's last great offensive from a genuine strategic surprise into the final proof that Germany no longer had the resources left to win the war it had started more than 5 years earlier. On December the 16th, 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the densely forested Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg, driving deep enough into thinly held American lines to create a visible bulge in the Allied front that gave the battle its lasting name in the popular imagination. By the time the fighting finally ended in late January of 1945, the offensive had been completely defeated. German forces had suffered casualties they could never realistically replace at this stage of the war, and the last significant reserves Germany possessed on the Western Front had been permanently destroyed months before the war in Europe itself finally came to an end that spring. The offensive achieved genuine, near-total surprise on its opening morning, a fact that made everything that followed considerably more painful in hindsight for the American units caught in its path. Allied intelligence had detected some signs of German build-up in the weeks before the attack, but senior commanders, convinced Germany no longer possessed the resources for a major offensive after months of continuous retreat on every front, largely dismissed the warning signs as evidence of local reinforcement rather than preparation for a genuine strategic gamble. The section of front German planners chose to attack through was held by American divisions that were either resting after heavy fighting elsewhere or newly arrived and still gaining combat experience, a deliberately selected weak point in the Allied line, rather than a random stretch of the front. When the attack came before dawn on December the 16th, some American units were overrun so quickly and so completely that entire regiments found themselves cut off and forced to surrender within the offensive's first 2 days. A level of initial shock that briefly threatened to unravel the entire Allied position in the region before reinforcements could arrive in strength. Mistake number 1, and it was baked into the plan before a single tank ever crossed the German border that December morning. The offensive's stated objective was the recapture of the Belgian port of Antwerp, a goal that would have required German forces to drive more than 100 miles through defended Allied territory in the middle of winter, splitting the American and British armies apart and, Hitler personally believed, forcing the Western Allies into a negotiated peace that would let Germany concentrate its remaining strength against the Soviet Union in the East instead. Several of Hitler's own senior commanders, including Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, privately regarded Antwerp as an unrealistic objective given the forces actually available for the operation, and proposed more limited alternatives aimed at simply destroying isolated American units rather than reaching a port more than 100 miles from the starting line under the worst possible weather conditions. Hitler rejected every scaled-down alternative and insisted on the full plan, committing Germany's last meaningful operational reserve to an objective several of his own generals privately doubted the available forces could ever realistically reach, regardless of how well the opening days of the attack actually went. Mistake number 2. And it turned an already ambitious plan into a mathematical impossibility from the very first day of fighting, rather than a risk that might simply not pay off later in the campaign. German forces began the offensive with roughly 5 million gallons of fuel stockpiled, enough to sustain the attacking divisions for approximately 6 days of sustained combat operations, a total that fell well short of what reaching Antwerp would actually require even under ideal conditions, with no delays of any kind along the way. A shortfall German quartermasters had calculated in advance and reported up the chain of command without it ever changing the underlying plan. The plan's entire fuel calculation depended on German forces capturing intact Allied fuel depots along the route of advance, a risky assumption built into the operational plan from its earliest drafts rather than a contingency added later out of genuine necessity once the fighting had already begun. And reality had already begun diverging sharply from the timetable on paper. Allied forces retreating in front of the German advance destroyed or successfully evacuated the fuel stockpiles German planners had counted on capturing, and German armoured columns began running critically low on fuel within days, tanks and vehicles abandoned by the roadside, not because they had been destroyed in combat, but because they had simply run dry, with no resupply anywhere within reach of the stalled columns. Mistake number 3, and it sacrificed the one genuine advantage German planners had actually built the entire operation around from the very beginning. German commanders deliberately timed the offensive to begin during a period of poor winter weather, specifically to ground Allied aircraft, whose overwhelming superiority in the air had punished every previous major German operation on the Western Front throughout the second half of 1944, without exception, destroying supply columns, armoured formations, and reinforcements almost anywhere they attempted to move in daylight. That weather advantage worked precisely as intended for the offensive's opening days, German columns advancing largely unmolested from above, while low cloud and heavy snow kept Allied fighters and bombers grounded at their own airfields hundreds of miles from the fighting, giving German commanders a genuine, if temporary, window free from the aerial harassment that had defined nearly every other engagement of the campaign in the West. The weather cleared after roughly a week, considerably sooner than German planners had gambled it would when they built their entire timetable around it, and Allied aircraft returned to the skies over the Ardennes in overwhelming numbers on December the 23rd, systematically destroying the fuel convoys, armoured columns, and supply lines the entire offensive had already become critically dependent on by that same point in the fighting. A single clear day undoing much of what the surprise attack had spent a week working to establish. Mistake number 4, and it cost the German advance the exact timetable its own fuel calculations had already made non-negotiable from the earliest days of planning. The road network through the Ardennes funneled traffic through a small number of key towns, and Bastogne, sitting directly astride several of the most important roads German forces needed to maintain their advance, became a strategic bottleneck German commanders chose to bypass rather than capture outright in the offensive's opening days, assuming the isolated American garrison would surrender or collapse on its own once fully surrounded by superior numbers. The garrison, anchored by the 101st Airborne Division under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, held out instead, McAuliffe famously replying with a single word, "nuts," when German commanders formally demanded his surrender on December the 22nd. Bastogne's continued resistance forced German traffic to detour around the town on roads never designed to carry that volume of military traffic, consuming precisely the fuel and the time mistake number 2 and mistake number 3 had already made impossible to spare, until General George Patton's Third Army broke through to relieve the town entirely by December the 26th, having turned an entire Army Corps north on remarkably short notice to reach the encircled garrison in time. Elsewhere along the same advance, the killing of American prisoners of war by German troops near the town of Malmedy, an atrocity that became widely known within days and hardened American resolve rather than intimidating it the way its perpetrators may have intended, further undercut whatever psychological advantage German planners had hoped the offensive's initial surprise might otherwise have produced among the troops now fighting to contain it. Mistake number 5, and it reflected a strategic reality no amount of tactical surprise could actually overcome once the initial shock of the attack had fully worn off across the Allied lines. Germany, even after scraping together every available reserve for the offensive, remained numerically inferior to the combined Allied forces on the Western Front. The same fundamental imbalance that had shaped the war since the Allied landings in Normandy 6 months earlier, and that no single winter offensive, however well planned, could realistically reverse on its own. Many of the divisions committed to the offensive were under strength, filled out with inexperienced replacement troops and equipment pulled from other, already weakened sectors of a rapidly contracting front, a force built more from desperation and improvisation than from genuine operational strength, held in reserve for exactly this kind of decisive moment. Germany could commit its last reserves to one final gamble, but it could not, regardless of how that gamble actually played out on the battlefield, replace the men and equipment it was about to lose in the attempt, a mathematical reality that made the offensive's ultimate failure considerably more consequential than a simple defeat would have been under less desperate circumstances. A separate element of the operation, though not one of the 5 decisive mistakes on its own, added to the general chaos of the offensive's opening days without meaningfully improving Germany's own actual position. Otto Skorzeny, the same commando leader who had earlier rescued Benito Mussolini from Italian captivity, led a special unit of English-speaking German soldiers disguised in captured American uniforms and equipment, sent behind Allied lines specifically to spread confusion, cut communications, and redirect traffic away from the genuine German advance. The operation caused genuine widespread paranoia among American troops, who began aggressively interrogating anyone whose identity seemed even slightly uncertain, but achieved little of lasting military value once the initial shock wore off. One more resource committed to an offensive that could not actually spare the men or the equipment for a diversion that never meaningfully changed the outcome of the fighting itself. What went wrong? Let's set the 5 mistakes side by side before looking at how they actually fed into each other. Because summarized together, they trace a chain of failure no single after-action report from any one sector of the front could have fully captured on its own. Mistake 1. Hitler insisted on the unrealistic objective of Antwerp over his own general's more modest, more achievable alternatives. A distant port, more than 100 miles beyond what the actual forces committed, could realistically be expected to reach. Mistake 2. The offensive's fuel plan depended on capturing Allied depots that were destroyed or evacuated before German forces ever reached them, leaving armoured columns stranded by the roadside within days of the attack's opening. Mistake 3. The deliberately chosen bad weather that grounded Allied aircraft cleared considerably sooner than German planners had gambled it would. exposing the entire advance to exactly the air power it had been specifically timed to avoid. Mistake 4. The decision to bypass rather than immediately capture Bastogne let the town become a bottleneck that consumed exactly the fuel and time the offensive could least afford to lose at the precise moment it needed, both most urgently. Mistake 5. Germany's own broader manpower and material shortage meant even a fully successful offensive could never have been sustained or exploited at the strategic scale Hitler had originally envisioned for it, regardless of how the fighting on any individual day actually went. These 5 mistakes did not happen in isolation from each other, and understanding how directly each one fed into the next explains the offensive's outcome far better than examining any single failure alone ever could. The unrealistic objective in Mistake 1 directly produced the impossible fuel math in Mistake 2, since only a campaign aimed at something as distant as Antwerp would have required gambling the entire operation on capturing enemy fuel supplies rather than simply carrying enough fuel for a more limited, achievable objective from the outset that did not depend on anything the enemy might or might not leave behind intact. The weather that cleared in Mistake 3 turned the fuel shortage from Mistake 2 into an outright catastrophe rather than a manageable constraint, since Allied aircraft, once freed to fly again after nearly a week of grounded operations, specifically targeted the fuel convoys and armoured columns already struggling to make up for supplies that had never materialised as originally planned. And the delay at Bastogne in Mistake 4 consumed the last remaining margin the offensive's own timetable had ever possessed, converting an already fuel-starved, weather-exposed advance into one that had also lost the road network and the schedule it needed to reach any of its original objectives before Allied reinforcements, arriving from every direction at once, closed off any remaining path forward entirely and permanently. The offensive's final cost fell heaviest on precisely the reserve's mistake 5 had already identified as irreplaceable long before the fighting itself was over. German casualties across the 6-week battle are generally estimated at somewhere between 80 and 100,000 men, killed, wounded or captured, alongside the near-total loss of the armoured vehicles and aircraft committed to the operation. Losses Germany's own contracting war economy had no realistic capacity to replace, with the war's final months already closing in from both the east and the west simultaneously. The offensive that Hitler had hoped would fracture the Western Alliance and buy time to concentrate against the Soviet Union instead consumed the last organised reserve Germany possessed on the Western Front, leaving the Rhine itself essentially undefended by the time Allied forces resumed their own advance into Germany barely weeks after the last fighting in the Ardennes had finally ended in late January. Historians studying the campaign since have generally treated it less as a genuine strategic gamble that simply failed to pay off, and more as a symptom of a leadership increasingly detached from the actual material limits of the war. It was still trying to win. A final offensive that consumed resources Germany's own military planners understood, in private, it could not actually spare for an objective they had already told their own Führer they doubted it could reach. The battle remains, by total American participation and casualties combined, one of the largest single engagements the United States Army fought in the entire Second World War. More than 600,000 American soldiers eventually committed to containing and reversing an offensive that had, for a handful of desperate days in late December, genuinely threatened to unravel the entire Allied position in Western Europe before its own internal contradictions caught up with it on the road to a port it was never actually going to reach. If you want more stories about the gambles that consume the last reserves of a losing war, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.